Greetings, cyber learners across the universe. I'm Gene, and I teach 5 classes for Excelsior. One of those classes is called Classical Astronomy, and one lesson in that Classical Astronomy class, I teach about the calendar and the calendar's connection to astronomy. And then within that class, there's a small little section that I would like to talk to you today. So let's get started. I've titled my little mini lecture, Time to Refresh. And the only reason I did that is because I couldn't think of another title. And maybe at the end of the lecture, it'll make sense. Let's go to the next slide. Let's stare at this for a few minutes and see what we're looking at. You're getting drowsy. No, I'm just kidding. This is obviously a picture of the Earth going around the Sun and the Moon going around the Earth. What's it here for? Well, let's think about how we keep track of time in our lives. And if you were to look at this picture and stare at it a little bit longer, you'd see that the Earth, the blue Earth, the whatever color that is, the blue Earth is rotating. So we know that that the rotating Earth is how we come up with our time measurement of a day. So let me write the word day down here. So that's a day is the Earth rotating once. And you can also see in this picture that the Moon is revolving around the Earth. And it takes 29.5 days for the Moon to get around the Earth. Well, guess what that would be? That would be, and it's not perfect because in a lunar month it would be, but we don't use lunar months. But the idea is still our timekeeper of the month, let me write the word month down, comes from this astrological occurrence, the month, if I can get this written down. The month is approximately, the word moon and month are attached to each other. So the month is how long it takes, approximately, for the Moon to get around the Earth one time. And now as we keep watching this, we see that the two of them, the Earth and the Moon, are circling the Sun. And you of course know that how long does it take for that to happen? One time? And the answer is a year. So we can see that as a general rule, a good rule, is that as far as keeping time, the day, the month, and the year are tied to astronomy and these astrological movements. So the question I have for you is, what's missing? What timekeeper is missing? Thinking, and probably you've come up with it, and that of course is the week. Where'd the week come from? Can you get the week from this, from astronomy? Let's go to our next slide. What about the week? Where did it come from? And we know, of course, that the week is very important to our day-to-day existence. We use it all the time. So if we just were to spend a second or two thinking about the week, we might want to ask these types of questions. Has it always been 7 days? Has the week, has there always been a week throughout history? If we go back into ancient times, did they have the week? And was it the same as the week that we have, that we use today? So those are kind of, and there might be some other questions you have in your mind about where did the week come from. Now I know that some of you are probably saying, I know where it came from. It came from the Bible. Well, you might be right, but don't get ahead of me. Stay with me. Let's go to the next slide and try to answer some of the basic questions about that we might have about the week. Has it always been the same? Well, it depends on what culture you look at. If you were to go back to the ancient Aztec civilization, they didn't even have a lunar month. Their month was 20 days, and then they divided their month into 4, and so they had a week of 5 days. If you go back to the ancient Egyptians, they had a month very similar to ours, a 30-day month, and then for their week they divided it into 3, so they had decades, so it would be 10. So the Aztecs had a 5-day week. The Egyptians had a 10-day week. The Athenians, with just a slight little twist to what the Egyptians were doing, also took 30, divided it by 3, and had a 10-day week. Now the Babylonians are what's fairly interesting because it's starting to look like 7. The Babylonians had a special segment of the month that was on day 7, day 14, day 19. I don't know where day 19 came from. Day 21 and day 28. So it starts to, the Babylonians begin to look like our modern day week, with one important exception, and that is the Babylonians were still, their week was tied to the month, the 7th day of the lunar cycle, the 14th day, 19th, 21st, 28th. It was, of course, the Hebrews that celebrated Sabbath or honored the Sabbath day every 7 days. So theirs was a 7-day week. And what makes it kind of different than anybody else, and that is it was called, and let's see if I can write this down, or I'll just put the word F, and the F stands for free. The Hebrews had a week of 7 days, and it was known as a free week, and it's free because it wasn't tied to anything. It's not tied to the month, and it's certainly not tied to the year. It's just kind of floating out there as a timekeeper, independent of any other timekeepers. So it's called a free week. Let's go to our next slide. So different scholars have tried to come up with different ideas or reasons of how did we get our free week. And so let's look at 3 other scholarly explanations for the free week that we are so familiar with. And some scholars say, well, that was easy. They just took the month and divided it by 4 and came up with 7 point, you could take the month, a lunar month, and you can see over here that I have the 4 phases of the moon. So if you just take the 4 phases, and we know it goes through the 4 phases in 29.5 days, divide it by 4, you come up with 7.38. So they say that's where we got our week. They just looked at the different phases of the moon. Well, you know what? Scholars, I think you're wrong. And the reason is because we have a free week. And if you use this as the origin of the week, this week, and it's, by the way, it's a partial 7.38, how do you do that? And it's still tied to the lunar month. But our week is not tied to the lunar month. So we think this explanation is bogus and inaccurate. Then some scholars say that the Babylonians are responsible for giving us the week, because you can see from the last slide as well that they had something going on the 7th, the 14th, the 19th, the 21st, and 28th. So if you don't count the 19th, you can see that they have every 7 days. Well, the problem with that is it's still tied to the lunar month. When it says 7, it's the 7th day of the lunar calendar. When it says 14, it's the 14th day of the lunar calendar. So that's an error. And the other point that we want to make to debunk the idea that we got our week from the Babylonians is that how did the Babylonians pass it on to the rest of the world? If they passed it on to the rest of the world, then you would have thought that whoever conquered them would have also picked it up. And the answer is they didn't do that. So when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Persian and the Medo-Persian Empire came along, the Medo-Persian Empire was not copying the Babylonian 7, 14, 19, 21, and 28. So it didn't happen that way. So we want to say the scholars who say that the Babylonians gave us our week are in error. So then there's another set of scholars that are really strong, and they say, oh, well, the week came from what is called the 7 visible planets. Because everybody, the scholars know that in ancient times, the ancients had this notion of what they called 7 visible planets. And they're over here on this, over here on the side here, it says that the sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, because they were visible. Now they knew, of course, that the sun and the moon were different than Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, but they still called them the 7 visible planets. And so they said, well, we must have gotten our week from those visible planets. The sun being Monday, the sun being Sunday, the moon being Monday, Mars is Tuesday, Mercury is Wednesday, Jupiter is Thursday, Venus is Friday, and Saturn is Saturday. Well, there's a major problem with this theory, and that is the Hebrews were practicing the free week before the level of astronomy arrived that even talked about these 7 visible planets. So the Hebrews were not necessarily knowledgeable or aware of or writing about these 7 planets when they were practicing the Sabbath, when they were honoring the Sabbath every 7 days. So the scholars are not accurate to say that that's where we got our week. So, as you know, what you might have already guessed 3 or 4 or 5 minutes ago is that the week comes from the Bible. And those of you that know the Bible know that in Exodus, in Exodus chapter 20 is when we learn about the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandment, Exodus 20 verse 8 says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is with you within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So, what's the point? That it comes from the Bible. Here's how I think the whole world now celebrates a 7-day free week. And that is the Hebrews / Jews were practicing honoring their 10 Commandments and honoring the Sabbath, and then they were either conquered or they migrated into other countries. And when they were living in other countries, those countries watched and observed the Jews practicing this, having this 7-day week and setting aside the 7th day. And they saw it as a good and beneficial thing. So they stopped doing their business, they took a break from their labors, and they worshiped God. And so even though the countries that they were in, they may not have been worshiping the one true God, they still thought the idea was good, and they started copying it. So the Persians and the Greeks and then the Romans. And so amazingly, to this day, every single country, every single religion around the globe practices a 7-day week, with the 7th day being something special that you take a break from your labors. So kind of cool information all about the week. I hope you enjoyed that. God worked 5 days to get the planet ready for us. He made us on day 6, and then he set day 7 aside for us to take a break from our labors and worship him. Well, let me see. I told you I teach classical astronomy for Excelsior. I just want to let you know what other classes I teach. I teach a class called History of Air Power and a class called Space, or Exploring Space, World War II, a full year course of modern history, 1815 to the present, and I also teach a junior high class that's called, it's actually a teaser class, that's a combination of astronomy, space, and history of air power. God bless you.